When you have a database client, and by that I mean anything that talks to a database, like a web app or batch job or whatever, that application is going to talk to a database server. The client is going to make requests to the server, and of course the server is going to respond with data. Now many applications, not all, but many, have a fixed set of queries. So for those applications, it might make sense to record these queries so that in production we can lock them down to make sure that the application is behaving as expected. Let's see how this would work. We're going to have a smart proxy between the database client and the server, and we need a database to store the allowable queries. So the client is going to issue queries and send them over to the proxy. The proxy is then going to record them in the set of authorized queries, and then the proxy is going to send the query to the database. So this is the learning phase. We're just recording the queries being sent by the client. Now moving to the enforcement phase. We're going to lock down the set of authorized queries. This is now a fixed set. So the client is going to send queries to the proxy. The proxy is going to look up that query in the set of authorized queries. In this case, it's going to find it, and therefore it's going to forward the query to the database. What about an unknown query? The database client is going to send it to the proxy, which is then going to look it up in the set of authorized queries, and this time it's not going to find it. The proxy is then going to reject the query and send an error back to the client. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use Postgres as a database server and pgadmin as a database client. It's a generic database query tool. And we'll use Gallium Data as a proxy between the two. We're going to use Redis to store the authorized queries. And we're also going to use Redis Insight to look inside of Redis. It's not strictly speaking required, but it'll give us visibility inside of Redis, which is nice. I'm going to run through the tutorial now, and if you want to follow along on your machine, assuming you have Docker installed and running, just go to galliumdata.com and go to the tutorial, and you can do that. So the first thing is to start various Docker images. So I'm just going to do that here. We can just copy the command. I'm going to speed things up a bit here because that's not particularly interesting. Keep in mind that if you do this on your own machine, assuming you have Docker up and running, it's going to take a little bit longer because you'll have to download the various images. Okay, so what we now have is this picture here. We have the Postgres server running, we have the pgadmin database client running, and we have the proxy, Gallium Data, running in between the two. We can make sure that everything is running properly by running this command here, and everything is happy. All right. Next, we're going to make sure that Postgres and Gallium Data are up and running properly. So we're going to launch pgadmin, log in as this, and we're just going to make sure that we can connect to the database, and everything seems to be fine. So that's good and happy. Moving on. We're going to need to start a copy of Redis and the Redis Insight client. So again, that's just a couple of Docker commands. All right, we're going to make sure that Redis is up and running. And yes, I already have a database. And the host name is Gallium Redis. The port is the standard 6379. We're just going to call this Redis. And let's click on it. Take a look at the browser. There's nothing in the database. That's exactly what we'd expect at this point. So Redis is up and running. Okay, so we're going to need to talk to Redis from our filter in the proxy in Gallium Data. So we're going to need to have some sort of Redis driver. There's a very nice one called Lettuce. So we just need to install it in Gallium Data. So I'm going to go into Gallium Data, go into the libraries page, and find that library. There it is, and here are the different versions of it. I'm just going to add the latest version. And I'm going to publish, and when I click on publish, you may notice that this is going to take a little bit, several seconds to respond. That's because Gallium Data has to download the database driver library and all its dependencies. Everything is happy. Moving on, we're now going to create the recording filter. That's the filter in the proxy that's going to capture the SQLs on their way to the database and store them in Redis. So I'll copy the code. Let's go into the repository in Gallium Data, and let's create a new request filter of type query filter Postgres. I'm just going to call it record queries in Redis. Give it the few lines of code here, and I can publish that. And that's it. At this point, this filter is active, so any queries that I run are going to be recorded in Redis. Let's make sure that's true. I'm going to open my handy-dandy query tool here in pgadmin and run a SQL. Again, I'll speed that up a bit here. Okay, I'm getting some data. Everything's behaving normally. And if I look in Redis, I'm going to see that there is, in fact, not just my query here, but other queries. Okay, so that's all very good. Next step is to create the enforcement filter. So I'm going to go copy the code, go into Gallium Data. I'm going to deactivate this request filter and create a different request filter. Same type, query filter Postgres. And this time I'm going to call it reject unknown queries. Again, the name doesn't matter. And here's the code for it. Connect to the database and reject any queries that we haven't seen before. So if I go back to my SQL tool, I rerun my query, everything is fine. But if I change my query, now suddenly it's rejected because the code is not finding that query in the Redis database. Well, that's pretty much it. There's, of course, a lot more to find out about Gallium Data. But what you've seen is just a very simple application of a smart database proxy with about 15 lines of code, and we have a pretty useful little system here in place. In the tutorial, you'll see that there is some recommendations on sort of next things, things that you could go beyond this. There's a lot of flexibility here. So if you're interested in databases, in particular Postgres and Mongo, check out Gallium Data. There is a lot you can do with it. At the end of the tutorial, there are the instructions on how to clean everything up. And that's it. Thanks for watching.